All right, so high speed and altered state, or your go and glow of stimulants and hallucinogens. So we're going to look at the clinical realities of stimulants and hallucinogens through a clinical lens. Not morality, not media portrayals, but what actually happens in the brain and the body and what that means for counseling practice. So first, let's start with why does this matter? Okay. So these substances are extremely common in college and adult populations, but they're often framed as harmless performance enhancers or spiritual tools. They're at high risk for misinterpretation of effects and harm, and clinical conversations requiring accuracy, not scare tactics, not minimization, not fear-based messaging needs to occur. So of these two drug classes, they're going in two very different directions. So stimulants are going to push your system forward. They speed up systems, they narrow focus, they increase drive. Hallucinogens do something very different. They alter perception, meaning, and an internal experience. What they share, however, is that they both change how the brain assigns importance. So let's start off with the stimulants because they're the most normalized and the most misunderstood. So here we have the stimulant scheduling. Schedule 1, 2, and then the unrestricted category of stimulants. So I want you to notice the range here. Some stimulants are Schedule 2 in the middle with accepted medical use, such as amphetamines, Adderall, right? Or Ritalin, right? Then you have the other unrestricted stimulants there, which are your minor stimulants, so your caffeine, your nicotine, your herbal stimulants like ephedra. And then you have your Schedule 1, which is your designer agents, so your MDMA, which is ecstasy, and there's no accepted medical use there. In the Schedule 2, you also have cocaine and crack and methamphetamine. But I just want to point out that legal status does not equal, in any regard, safety, okay? It reflects cultural, political, and historical decisions, not equate to safety here. So all stimulants are not the same. This slide is critical. People like to lump stimulants together, but their mechanisms, right? The picture that I drew for you of the neurons and how those communicate, they're very different. So caffeine is going to remove the tired signal completely. So it's going to block your adenosine, which is your tired signal. Cocaine blocks dopamine reuptake, which means your brain is flooded with dopamine, okay? And then amphetamines increase the release and reverse transport, okay? So they're actively pushing those neurotransmitters out. So those differences, they matter clinically. So what do stimulants target? They primarily act on dopamine and norepinephrine, and they activate the sympathetic nervous system. The phrase I want you to remember is reward hijack. The brain learns very quickly that this matters. Okay, so stimulants and effects. In the short term, people feel focused and energized, but anxiety, irritability, sleep disruption, cardiovascular strain often follow. The absence of immediate harm does not mean the absence of cost here. Remember that. So in the structures of the neurotransmitters, right, and the neurons, what does it look like? So amphetamines, structurally, they're structural analogs, okay? So they are built very similar to norepinephrine, dopamine, and epinephrine. So basically, they look like natural neurotransmitters. The brain can't tell the difference. So that structural similarity lets them cross right through the blood-brain barrier efficiently. That extra methyl group in methamphetamine, then pushes the speed and the potency, which increases both euphoria and risk here. So we see in this picture the drive of the amphetamine, right? Of the norepinephrine, the dopamine, and the epinephrine. So it's a massive release and it blocks the reuptake. So it all floods out. So this results in the SNS fight or flight overdrive. Okay, your epinephrine is released and your norepinephrine is released in the fight or flight. So expert spotlight, why does the extra methyl group in methamphetamine increase its potency over Adderall? And it's that blood-brain barrier speed. And that's the kettlecholanes. All right, so cardiovascular toxicity. A lot of times people cannot have access to amphetamines if they don't get a heart check, right? If the doctor doesn't listen to their heart, they don't run their numbers, they don't get blood work done. And that's because stimulants have a high risk of arrhythmias, right? Extreme, which is irregular heartbeat rhythm, extreme hypertension, vascular damage, all of that can occur even at therapeutic doses for some people. So stimulant overdose is dangerous. It's sympathetic nervous system overdrive. So why is a stimulant user at a high risk for convulsions and death by overdose? It's because of the sympathetic nervous system overdrive. So withdrawal, the crash timeline here. So stimulant withdrawal doesn't look like opioid withdrawal, but it is clinically dangerous still. The crash phase carries high suicide risk due to exhaustion and depression. And then later phases involve anhedonia and intense craving. So we see crash is 1 to 14 days. You have agitation, depression, exhaustion, increased suicide risk, followed by withdrawal, which could last 1 to 10 weeks, anhedonia, which means no joy, obsession with drug seeking, intense craving. And then 3, extinction. That would be you have extinct the desire for it, the need for it, the withdrawal is extinct, indefinite. Normal pleasure returns, but triggers or cues remain dangerous because the brain remembers, okay? So the next slide is very, very important. The energy debt principle here. Stimulants do not create energy. They borrow energy from sleep, mood, and attention. So the model that we're looking at today, in today's model, 70% is spent quickly and only 7% is recovered per day, right? So this explains why people feel confident and productive right before they collapse. Also why it takes so long to recover, right? Why we're looking at these longer timelines here for recovery, right? 1 to 10 weeks. Right, the crash is 1 to 14 days. That's because we're looking at this energy debt. Okay, 70%, they're recovering at a rate of 7% per day. It's pretty intense. So generally, that's stimulants. Now let's break it down into a couple variants of stimulants. So we have amphetamines. So amphetamines cause dependence, not just because of euphoria and their euphoric properties, but because they mask fatigue. They can be legally prescribed by physicians, and abuse occurs in people who acquire their drugs by both legitimate and illegal access, which will complicate your assessment. So there are FDA-approved indications for amphetamines, and this is where the tension lives, just like your debate that you had to talk about. So these drugs are FDA-approved for ADHD, narcolepsy, and sometimes weight loss. And they can be clinically helpful. Approval answers a medical question, but not an ethical one, which is where the debate was. So for ADHD, it's this paradoxical calming effect on focus and impulse control. Narcolepsy, managing chronic sleep attacks through stimulation, right, keeping them awake during the day. And then weight loss, short-term anorexiant use, right? So it's an appetite suppressant. So expert spotlight, what is the risk of confident euphoria in a high-achieving law student using Adderall? And it could be masking the physiological depletion. All right, next stimulant is cocaine. So cocaine has had 3 eras. The first era being Freudian time. So he had his cocaine papers, and this was chewing, right? The indigenous chewing, the original Coca-Cola formula. And then in the second era, in the 1920s, the high society jazz age was associated with status and nightlife to use the cocaine. And then the third era was the 1980s, which was the rise of crack and the dramatic drop in price. So for a fix was only $10. So cocaine's meaning has shifted significantly across history. Substance use effects don't change, but how society views and understands their use does. So this matters for stigma, access, and you'll see it with policy. So when we look at cocaine, there's various routes of administration, and these routes of administration change the onset speed and the intensity. So if we look at smoking, which would be crack, freebasing, that is going to be the fastest onset. Intravenously, so through injection, you have high intensity there. Intranasal, so snorting, that would be intermediate amount of onset. And then oral through chewing, drinking would be the slowest, right? Because it has to go through the stomach and be absorbed through the lining, intestinal lining, which is thick, right? Here's the slide. I'll make a big gesture. That way, if you're watching and you know to stop the thing right here, stop the video. This is the slide I told you that you have to see. Speedball, okay? So speedball is something you'll hear about frequently if you're working in the field. So lethal synergy. This is combining cocaine or meth with heroin or fentanyl. The stimulant, right? Stimulant and a depressant here, right? The stimulant is going to mask the overdose until it wears off, eventually causing respiratory failure. Okay, so I take the, but a client would take the cocaine or the meth, which is an upper, and would make them have the energy that they would not have if they were just doing the fentanyl or the heroin, and it would mask that, right? So harder time breathing, all of the effects that you experience when you're taking high doses of fentanyl or heroin are masked by the upper of the stimulant, and ultimately respiratory failure occurs. So it's very, very, very dangerous, very dangerous. And the ability to tell how much heroin they've taken at that point, it's very, very dangerous. So pay attention to this slide. Okay, so cocaine versus crack cocaine. Okay, so here you see the 2 different things here. So crack cocaine is going to be a solid rock-like form of drug, typically going to be smoked, known for its notorious reputation. And then cocaine on the left is powdery white drug, a white powder. And so one is typically smoked, one is typically inhaled. Pharmacologically similar, socially treated very differently. Okay, you see cocaine used in with more affluent populations, right? You see cocaine typically used with Hollywood stars and judges and lawyers, and whatever more affluence is associated with cocaine use. With crack use, you see that associated with more poor populations, you could say. So this slide is here just to remind you that addiction is never just biological. There's also social and economic implications for addiction as well. All right, so let's look at some minor stimulants. We'll call them minor. And the main one that I'm looking at right now, or a minor stimulant, I should say, is caffeine. Okay, so caffeine is the world's most used stimulant, and it still has the highest toxicity at high doses, or it has high toxicity at high doses, I should say. So if you have over 500 milligrams of caffeine, which my 2 cups a day might, it's not that much, you could have panic sensations and chills, muscle twitches and ramming thoughts, and a lethal dose is 5 to 10 grams, which could lead to seizures. Caffeine has a cerebral effect, so it constricts vessels, so it does help with migraines. So some people will say, oh, if you have a migraine, drink a soda, right? Or you guys in Ohio, pop, drink a pop, right? Such a silly name. And then respiratory effect, it opens the air passages and it does facilitate breathing, okay? So question, list one over-the-counter product that contains caffeine besides coffee or soda, and I put Excedrin or NoDoz, right? Those both have caffeine also. But I just want to point out here that because this is minor, it does not mean harmless, okay? Caffeine can have very negative effects on your heart as well. So there's benefits, but there's also a negative impact there, potential as well. Okay, so now we shift from speed to perception. We're looking at hallucinogens. So first we're going to look at the OGs. We're going to look at the classic ones, the ones that have been around forever. Okay, the LSD, the psilocybin. Okay, so classic hallucinogens, they primarily act on the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor. They don't add experiences so much as change how experiences are interpreted here. We're talking about the DMN, the default mode network. So when we talk about the DMN here, this is your narrative sense of self. It's your internal dialogue. So when your DMN is quiet, people experience ego dissolution and altered meaning. So that can feel healing or terrifying, depending on the context. And that's what you're experiencing here. Next category we have is the disassociatives, and they produce detachment, right? You're disassociating, so detachment, rather than this perceptual disorientation. The person may feel separated from their body or reality in general. And so that's your ketamine, your PCP. And then you have MDMA. So this combines stimulant activation with emotional openness, right? And increased empathy and openness. The risks here are overheating, dehydration, and a mood crash afterwards, okay? And so we have to be careful with clients that are on that, right? MDMA, right? Ecstasy, that's what we have there. So I want you to look at these drugs. I always like to encourage a harm reduction lens. And so harm reduction, as a reminder, is not endorsement, okay? It's just clinical realism, all right? So for stimulants and a harm reduction lens, we're saying sleep and cardiovascular risk are central, okay? So we want to remind our clients, hey, it's really important to protect your heart. It's really important to get that sleep. Okay, so we got to reduce the stimulants because we want to protect your heart. We want to make sure you're getting enough sleep. That's really important. All right, for the hallucinogens, we're setting the set and the setting matter. Okay, so let's make sure that if you are going to do it, that you're in a safe space. All right, we want to make sure that they're psychologically aware of their vulnerability. Right, their psychological vulnerability is protected there too. Okay, and so their set and their setting matter there. So putting up some boundaries to help them as we reduce their harm, their potential for harm there. All right, so historical snapshot here. LSD was discovered in 1943. Drugs don't exist outside of culture, so remember cultural contexts shape meaning here, and meaning shapes use, risk, and treatment. So the effects are not only pharmacological, and that's what was important from the book on the history of LSD. And then here's where we would go to our beautiful digital escape room, and alas, we did not get to it. And that's absolutely okay, because we got to learn about SBIRT, and that was so informative and fun. So just a reminder, you got to do your AA meetings. And as always, if you need anything from me, it's masmith@jcu.edu. And you have a wonderful week. See you next week.